no further ado, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Associate Dean, Elspeth Murray.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and certainly to be the first speaker for such, I think, what's going to be just a great conference. I've been at Queen's for about 14 years. I'm a professor of strategy and entrepreneurship, and I think probably why I got put on the agenda first up is I might have a slightly different perspective on the topic for discussion today. So you have a copy, I think, of the slides in your goodie bag, as Yolande pointed out, and certainly a copy of the paper on a USB key as well. I have been studying entrepreneurship for a number of years, but I have not been doing it in the context of rurally based ventures. So this is really the start of a new research project. So what I'm going to talk about today are really two initial case studies. One in St. John, New Brunswick, and one in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, that we think are sort of two very interesting examples of successful new ventures in a rural context. And kind of step back and take you through an answer to the following questions. I have to tell you, my co-author, Andrew Waitman, is a former venture capitalist and the CEO of a startup company in Ottawa. And when I proposed that we do this paper, he said, "Are you kidding?" Said, from my venture capital days, we would never look at a business in a rural community for a whole variety of reasons, because they're inherently disadvantaged. And if we can, invest in one in an urban context for which, there are supply and demand considerations, then we would always choose the urban community. So I worked hard on them and said, no, there's got to be, cautious optimism here. So the title of our paper is, Rural Requiem or Revival. And I can only say that once because it is a bit of a tongue twister. And so anyways, we sought out to start the research project by trying to find some success stories. And obviously we need to enlarge our sample and look at the ones that didn't make it so we don't suffer from survivor bias and all of those things. So what I'm going to report out on is sort of the answer more so to the second question, is really how can these ventures from an entrepreneur's perspective be successful. I'm going to talk about something that we heard from a lot of entrepreneurs, and that's the notion of what is one's unfair advantage. Starting this work, it was kind of fascinating to look at one very critical challenge, I think, in the research in this whole area. Number one is that most of it is US based. So that's a bit of a problem because we have significant geographic differences, and what is, quote, rural in Canada is completely different than what is rural in the United States. So we spent some time thinking about how we would define rural. And so a couple of really simple definitions. One thing that we realized very quickly is that we could spend the entire paper just trying to make the case for, why we chose St. John, New Brunswick, and Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. But Jane Jacobs, a noted economic geographer, really made the point very simply that there's a big difference between great cities and little cities, towns, and other regions. And Adam Smith, who I think we all know, noted way back in 1776 that there are certain types of economic activity that can only occur in great cities. So we have constrained our definition of rural to include any area that is not part of a great city. And we could debate, I'm sure, for the rest of the day, which of the Canadian cities would fit into that. But it's in the paper, and I don't want to spend a whole bunch of time on it here. But you can go across the country in Vancouver, Calgary, Edmonton, so on and so forth. Obviously, there's a huge issue with what defines success. And what we decided to do, this is all about the creative economy, and even in that definition, there's an incredibly broad perspective of what we mean by that, which I think is getting even broader from my read of the literature. Given my co-author is a former venture capitalist, we decided that we would focus on what he would describe as the go big or go home ventures. So these are enterprises that have the ability to be major players on a global scale. And we defined success as ventures that had created or could create significant economic value. And we used two measures as proxies for that: the attractiveness to a potential acquirer, and also the ability to actually go public. Meaning that if the regulatory bodies and if investment bankers thought there was enough value creation to float it on the public markets, then there probably was. So hence, two of the initial case studies were Radian 6, that's St. John, New Brunswick, they're in the business of social media, and HB Studios, which is a game developer with tremendous links to electronic arts, which I'll come back to. So what does the literature say about rurally based new ventures? Nothing good. So at least 12 factors work against success for new ventures in rural areas. All the way from, even though the literature suggests that it's venture capital, it's mostly capital or investment capital, period. Finding experienced entrepreneurs, finding the labor force, accessing suppliers, accessing customers, government policies, proximity, I mean, on and on. All the way down to the third bullet point from the bottom I found fascinating, the receptivity of the local population. So one would think that if you were blowing in with a brand new venture that was going to employ a bunch of people, that everyone would welcome you with open arms, right? Sadly not. So the power elite in local communities, so on and so forth, appears to be a problem. Supportive services, and there's a huge category, obviously, with respect to attractive living conditions. And much of what the literature says is that urban areas are much more attractive, especially to creative class entrepreneurs. You know, good restaurants, this is the coal face of, you know, life. Schools for kids, theater, all of that kind of stuff. And I know in some of our rural communities we have a bit of an edge on that front. So we talked to 29 entrepreneurs in our kind of professional and personal networks to just ascertain their views on setting up a business in a rural context. So first of all, most of them, you know, first phrase out of their mouths, startups are hard, period. Why would you complicate what is already hard by doing something in a rural context where there are inherent disadvantages? So as you look down this list, there's some similarities, and this is, you know, from an entrepreneur's perspective, how they would frame the issue. So the talent pool is obviously a challenge. What I found very interesting was the customer proximity, not just the cost of being remote from customers, but the lack of sort of coal-face relationship, and that was really for learning and validation, because it's rare that you start off a business doing exactly what you thought you were going to do. So you are testing things, you were getting feedback, you were refining your thinking. Another interesting difference was the lack of intense competitive pace. Most of the entrepreneurs we talked to said, you know, when you're in an urban environment, you're sort of in the game every day. There is that speed, there is that pressure, and where do you get that from when you're not surrounded by a bunch of people who are going after, you know, sort of the holy grail, so to speak. The last one that I found kind of fascinating as well was the media ignores you, out of sight, out of mind. And in an age of social media and getting coverage and being on the radar screen, if you are not covered by the media, then where do you get time and attention? And many organizations use media, again, as a proxy for legitimacy. So if you combine these two lists, what we said is, yeah, they may be at an inherent disadvantage. The list grows to 15 if you combine the two. So let's have a look at whether or not we can find a couple of ventures and go down this list and just see how they addressed each and every one of these issues. The way in which we decided to tackle that from a research methodology perspective was to go back to a very influential article that was written in the Harvard Business Review in 1998 by Bob Zeider. He's a venture capitalist, and the article was How Venture Capital Works. And we thought that the notion of probability of success was kind of interesting when you look at all of those factors. This is just an illustrative example of how a venture capitalist thinks about investing in a business and whether or not that business is going to be successful. And the reality is that all of these events have to occur in order for the business to be a success. And if you combine the probability of the individual events, simple multiplication, the combined probability of success in this case is only 20%, even if each of those individual items has an 80% probability of success. So you can see where we're going with this is that if you look down the list for rurally based ventures, the probability of success for each individual one, there's probably a case to be made that it is that much lower, therefore the combined probability is lower. Most of the entrepreneurs we talk to as well, this is the way they think. You know, the list on the whiteboard that says today, from this long list of 15 items, what should I be focusing on? And how do I shift those odds? How do I get an edge on 1, 2, or 3 items? And how does that, generally speaking, give me a much better shot at overall being successful? So without trying to be too mechanistic here, this is in our initial cut at this. We thought this would be kind of an interesting way of looking at the notion of, from an entrepreneur's perspective, all other things being equal, what is your edge? And that's what we refer to as sort of an unfair advantage. So our 2 preliminary case studies, I thought I'd just spend a couple of moments mentioning them. I looked down the list here. There is someone from Nova Scotia, is there not? So do you know HB Studios in Lunenburg and the very interesting story behind that? So we went into our own networks to figure out who would give us time so that we could spend some time talking to them to figure out what was going on. I did a piece for the Globe and Mail actually evaluating Radian 6, so that was my link, and my co-author had a link into HB Studios, Honeybee Studios. So I'll just give you a little bit of background as to what these companies do and how they sort of came to be, where they came to be, and then we'll get into some of what we found. So HB Studios develops games for electronic arts. Jeremy Wellard, who is the founder and CEO, was a longtime employee at EA Studios in the UK. He married a Canadian girl, this is an important part of the story, from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. So if you wonder how this hotshot game developer ended up in rural Nova Scotia, it's a very common story. So this is an example in the creative economy. You're developing games. Surely you can do that from anywhere, right? Especially because it's online. You just have to find the talent. You're not shipping products. You don't have to worry about transportation costs, et cetera, et cetera. So they decided to set up shop in Lunenburg and hire a bunch of young, smart engineering students from universities in Halifax, relocate them to Lunenburg, and start to have this very cool business. They bought an old theater and renovated it into the classic, nifty working space for hotshot, game developers. So foosball tables, cappuccino machines, cots, all kinds of stuff. So I did a very interesting job on that. First-time entrepreneur, he'd worked for big business before, so we had no ace in the hole in terms of been there, done that. Radian 6 is a slightly different story. A founder who'd done it before, a guy by the name of Chris Lewis, who was an entrepreneur with a successful company called Q1 Labs, and got connected through a local angel investor to an experienced startup CEO, a guy by the name of Marcel Lebrun, who had been there, done that with a company called iMagic TV. So a very interesting combination of 2 people, not only the founder but the CEO, who had great deal of experience in starting up and growing a business. And what you also had was a technical founder who was smart enough to know when to bring in an experienced CEO, because he'd been a technical founder, but never the CEO. So those are the 2 companies. And our hypothesis in looking at those 2 firms was that, rurally based ventures are at an inherent disadvantage unless there is some secret sauce. or what we would call unfair